Hey guys, in this very interesting segment with Dr. Dario Nardi, we talk about subtypes and how even though there are stable subtypes, there are subtypes that evolve over the course of the lifetime. So you could be more than one subtype depending on where you are in life in the course of your own development. And we talk about the feminine and masculine versions of each of the functions and how this plays into the subtypes. And I want to let you know that I have this really interesting video with Dr. Nardi in which he talks about unearthing the treasures from the unconscious, something that is cut off from modern society. I have it on my new channel. I have it a link to that video right up here. And there's a lot more to look forward to in this interview with Dr. Nardi, in which later on he's going to talk about how you could use these subtypes to be able to inform your own personal growth. And that's later on down the line, so stay tuned and subscribe to this channel. You want to talk about the subtypes in a way.
Hmm. Oh yeah, so there's lots of other facets of the book. Um, the bulk of it is these coaching packets, and they're just one page in each of the 30-page packets. Uh, that take people from like the social experience, the role it plays, to the strengths, to where it shows up in the brain, to what Jung had to say about it, and the shadow side and the pitfalls, and then the ways that we can differentiate to overcome one-sidedness, to transcend.
Hmm.
And along that story is one piece about the flavors of each function and how it can appear differently. And it started with the analysis of brain wiring data. And one of my interns, I mean, we parse the data in different ways, but I was just like, well, what if we just reduce everything to like two, like A and B? Like, what is it going to look like? Do we actually even have two, like using cluster analysis in a way? Like, there are two different kinds of networks.
Mhm.
And each network is actually, like for ENFP was the first one we did. And what was so interesting is then when we looked at the demographic data, like who had which network. And for, we'll call the networks like analytic and holistic. And there's a reason, neuroscience reason for that, but it doesn't have to be those words. Um, and I found some really interesting things. One is that for the bulk of people age 25 to like 55 or 60, the differentiator clearly was career. That an ENTP who is a psychotherapist or an artist is definitely going to develop a different brain than the ENTP who is like a tech entrepreneur
Mhm.
or works as the high-powered CEO or in law, for example. Like
Mhm.
they're different. They have different skill sets. They use their brain differently. They come off differently. And I did find for the 15 to 25-year-old group that the biggest factor was sex, so male and female sex. Um, but that disappeared, once we actually started looking at career. And,
Mhm.
and that made sense because there's this, in adolescence, like all of the like hormones and like dating and all of these things are playing roles, and people are experimenting with social roles and like, oh, I'm supposed to be like this, or guys are like this, or whatever it is. But once we get into our careers, I think we let go of those, not entirely, but they're superseded by what our careers bring us for the rest of our lives.
Mhm.
And then I found in the oldest age bracket, which I did draw in both 55 and at 65 sometimes, looking at different things, the differences disappeared. And
Mhm.
so there was this integrated, they just didn't show these two like analytic holistic as much, that there was a
Wow.
combined piece. And this really got me to think like, oh, there's two versions of each type, and each of them is a foreground, is the background to the other, background to one and foreground for the other. So like the male and female, or we want to say like analytic careers and holistic careers version of ENFP, and you look at them visually, the wiring diagrams, and you're like, oh, the foreground for the analytic one is in the background, is like the gray elements of the holistic one.
Mhm.
And the stuff that's like really prominent in the holistic one is like there faintly in the background for the analytic one. So I
Interesting.
think throughout all of type, we could talk about like background, foreground. And and I'm like, okay, and then of course, like I continued to look at the next one I looked at was ENFJ because I had the socionics folks asking me about ENFJ. And then I'm like, well, I'm going to do INTJ because I'm curious.
Mhm.
And we can have different levels of granularity. So I could talk about 24 or 8 or 4 or 2, whatever it was. And I really saw like, wow, there are these two versions. And in fact, the brain wiring, because the brain wiring relates to skills in the brain, that they come with look and feel is just different. And I myself, in my own experience as dominant introverted intuiting, I thought at 35, like I had sort of maxed out by then, like what NI can do.
Hmm.
I was like, yeah, I have like it's like a creative catalyst, a relationship with the unconscious, like all of that. Boy, was I wrong. There is another version of NI that's like the Greek oracle
Hmm.
that is not goal directed, that doesn't have this like turning impressions into concepts. Isn't some it like in some models they call it like a masculine version of NI or whatever.
Hmm.
There's this other version that's like a receptive version of NI, that we
Yeah, it's
allow the archetypes to come up and we allow the archetypes to embody us
hmm.
and or become embodied.
So you've been, and when you look at people, you could see that difference. That there seems, when you're mentioning these subtypes, I could visualize them and getting from my memory. I'm like, yeah, there seems to be distinctions like this. So,
And of course it's not binary.
hmm.
It's in the instructions on another different page than what I posted on the internet. It's like, well, you can just check off one side or the other as like handedness, like I'm more this or I'm more that, or you can assign percentages. Or really you can do like we talked about, like are you doing either of them very well, or is it like undeveloped, or is it very one-sided? So I
Yeah.
think the challenge is if somebody is like say an ENTJ and their TE is very much the manager version of TE, which allows for things like quantity over quality.
Hmm.
Or is it more like the builder version of TE, which is like the accountant in a way, which says like detail is important and I can handle a lot of complexity and I pay attention to that complexity, like as if I were, an architect.
Hmm.
And that's, slightly different words depending upon which of the TJ types we're talking about. And and as I began to think about it, I'm like, oh right, like there are ENFPs who come across as this like they're selling something, like they're super enthusiastic, like they have like this very outgoing quality, they're promoting everything like in a, like almost like creating the magic deliberately.
Hmm.
And then there's another version of extroverted intuiting with ENFPs that is this like I remain open in a way that allows the magic to emerge on its own.
Hmm.
And I observe people and their interactions, and stuff goes on in my head. And I wait for that moment quietly when I can intervene in order to turn the whole group in a different direction.
Yeah.
A much more patient version, a more quiet version. And we might stereotypically think like, oh, one is INFP and one is ENFP or something like that. But actually, I think those are stereotypes.
Hmm.
And that if we really want to appreciate and I think help people find best fit type, there are reasons why people have a challenging, a difficulty, because as we read like a type literature, oftentimes, I mean, most of the time, the literature is written by one person from their perspective, and they're writing a certain flavor of that function or of that
Yeah.
type.
And they're
And
bringing in their own personality too.
yeah, yeah, and I felt, it applies even to non-preferred functions. So as I looked at like extroverted sensing, I'm like, am I the mover version of extroverted sensing, which is like very active and daredevil and like, has no problem being aggressive and like pushing into space and courting danger, which is like almost like hyper masculine SP version of it. Um, or am I like the sensate version of SE, which enjoys pleasure and relaxation and the smell of something and the experience of something. And I
Mm.
don't mean in an SI way, like it's not reminding me of the past or anything. It's just like it's more sensuous. And sometimes we can relate pretty well to both. And it's a matter of context. Like I've had very few opportunities in life to actually function as a manager,
Hmm.
but I know that there are INTJs who are admitted in high levels in organizations which have the capacity to harness a lot of resources. And not just like team manager, but I'm thinking from an INTJ perspective, like harnessing resources to do creative projects sounds awesome. But I work on my own. And so I end up doing this like craft or builder or architect version of TE instead. And that's simply a matter of opportunity and I think a little bit of training to get used to it. I think it can also explain where, like, I look at FE, and there's a version of FE, like the host version, which, is not my favorite functional area,
Hmm.
but when it's done well, I appreciate it. I don't have any problem with it.
Hmm.
And then there's this other version of, like, the shepherd version of FE,
Hmm.
which honestly I can find incredibly offensive.
Hmm.
And because it often clashes with my TE, because it's much more active and deliberate in its way of like recruiting people to adhere to values, the social values.
Hmm.
And I'm like, don't impose your social values on me. Like, I'm totally cool if for like the hosting and the paying attention to others' needs. But of course, the host also can end up feeling in life like they get stepped on.
Right.
Like people use them. And they're like, what about my needs? Or maybe they don't get things done, whereas the shepherd actually, can actually get quite a bit done in their lives. And
Hmm.
that can be quite empowering. And I know this is not just like, oh, certain types gravitate to certain ways, because like this work was shared with like there's an ESTP group that I'm a member of. I just lurk, but I was invited. I'm a member. Yes, there are ESTPs who like type, not in any like theoretical way, but lots of memes and whatnot. ESTPs are awesome, and they definitely like. Some of them are like, yeah, I'm totally like the mover version. Others like, no, I'm much more the sensate version, and that's cool. Like either one,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely see those two different styles, and I felt like the history behind this, your work with Galenko, is an interesting history. So, do you want to share that with everybody?
Sure, yeah. So, one of the things that Galenko has contributed, and I don't have his book in front of me, but it's he has his book, which is in English, has descriptions of 64 subtypes. So 16 types, but four versions of each, and it's really fascinating to read. Like they're like facets of a gem, and it's like I can relate to all of the INTJ subtypes, but one of them is definitely more me.
Hmm.
It's like it brings out more certain things, and it's like there's times when I've been some of the other ones. Um, the normalizing one, because I'm the creative one and they're like opposite of each other, is like definitely the furthest away. But I know they're normalizing INTJs, like
Hmm.
that's who they are. Um, and so he has this like these four subtypes in a way: that dominant, creative, normalizing, and harmonizing. and he does a really good job in his book of relating this back to the work that's like in DISC and social styles. I saw it very much as like so on target with the work of Dr. Helen Fisher, who has looked at neurotransmitters and hormones
Hmm.
and the personality profiles that she draws from those like are so spot on that you would, if you read one set of descriptions or the other, except for like some language stylistic things and like the label they give to each one, you wouldn't know the difference.
Right.
And what I found was I'm like, okay, if I take a type like ENFP and I don't divide them into two, I'm going to go to a level that just like allows for all the different brain wiring and then cluster them into four or eight. And Helen Fisher also, even though it's not very well known, she doesn't just talk about four, she actually talks about eight as well.
Hmm.
Um, and I'm like, there they are. There's the normalizing version of, and I remember with Victor and some other people in this thing, and I'm like, here's the brain wiring of normalizing ENFJ. And normalizing doesn't mean the person's like highly conventional or whatever. It's the verb normalizing. So the ENFJ is still like, the little bit of like the spiritual alien kind of thing, but they're bringing something to the world to make it a norm, and they have a sense of how they're gonna do that in a way that's like socially acceptable. That involves a lot of repetition, like a trainer or something like that, a doctor. Um, but there's also like the dominant version of ENFJ, which can be in an organization and very much can seem like ENTJ
Hmm.
or something like that, like really really like hard nosed and conveying all of that like in charge style. There are other ENFJs which are creative
Hmm.
version and the harmonizing version, which is the harmonizing I think is a little bit of the stereotype. And the harmonizers are the ones who think like, oh well, maybe I'm an ENFP or an INFJ,
Hmm.
and because their job, like they're a psychotherapist or they lead group workshops and they're a facilitator and they take like a much more nuanced role,
Hmm.
um, and the mediator, whatever it is. And so it really is allowing people, one, to honor not just nature but nurture. And the
Hmm.
Minnesota twins genetic twin studies like gives the same results for the MBTI dimensions as it does for five factor model.
Hmm.
Each of the four dimensions has like a 40 to 60% genetic component
Hmm.
to it. But where's the nature part? Like not all INFPs are the same. I'm sorry, like they're just not.
Hmm.
And to try and push them all into one box, I think explains why. I mean, at least in my experience, there's like one out of four people will have a delay or difficulty in locating their type.
Hmm.
Most of them will eventually locate their type, but there's always that 5%, maybe 10% that like just nothing fits.
Hmm.
They can't locate their type. And it could be because the stereotype of their type, like, oh, ISFPs are supposed to be very creative and carefree and whatever. Well, not all ISFPs are like that.
Hmm.
Like they really aren't. And that's what I loved about Victor's work. He's like, there's a normalizing version of ISFP, and maybe that ISFP is a customs agent,
Hmm.
and that's where they ended up in life. And the introverted feeling and extroverted sensing show up, but in like they're not this like flower child artist,
Right.
and that's okay. And then the fun part was seeing how these two different versions of each function actually come together and fit with the four sort of subtypes.
Hmm.
Or if we can say eight, because Helen Fisher was like, no, we can actually break these down into eight.
Hmm.
Um, and then we can get a whole bunch of subtypes. We can say that they're 256 or 64 or 512 or however 32,000, wherever we want to go.
Hmm.
I think I stop at a point where I'm like, this is where the data can take us in terms of validation. And I believe it made sense in the 1940s and even the 1990s to say there's 16 types because people can't hold more than 16
Right.
or maybe 32. But beyond that, I think now with the internet, with assessments, the way that things can be automated in a sense with like a soft kind of AI, a mix and match, that we can deliver descriptions to people, we can deliver understanding to people that says like, hey, there's like 1,000 types. I
Mm-hmm.
want to say subtypes. I'm not going to say types. I say the word subtype because subtype means development.
Mm-hmm.
It's like this is how you developed. The type is actually the coherent part, like the core, like pine tree versus oak tree versus elm tree. But then each of those, like there's 10 pine trees and they all develop differently
Mm-hmm.
based on environment. And so I'm like, okay, so that's where the subtype comes in.
Yeah, I definitely see how, like, looking at a certain type, there's such a very distinct variety of expressions of that type. And I also see this thing like it really uh, having these subtypes help normalize people's experiences because it's really how they channel those functions in their life. And I hear this theme about like there's a timing to this too. Like we can't like start with 1,000 subtypes in the very beginning.
No, right, right. And I really felt like, what is it that I can deliver to people that would allow them to get to this point? So there's the cognitive processes assessment, which now has this whole 130,000 people and validation and all of that. And that will help people locate what is their, I'm just saying from like a defensible point of view. Not like these things are 100%, like spot on all the time or whatever. It's just about statistics and what's defensible in the same way that five-factor model is defensible and whatnot. That we can locate a person's lead perceiving function and their lead judging function. And then we can give them, and this is wonderful, Helen Fisher has developed this four flavors assessment based on her work, and it is validated. And because the descriptions are so similar to Victor Galenkos' ones, which also match what I found in the brain wiring, and most people are not going to get like a brain imaging session. I'm like, we can take these two different assessments, and then we could take Roger Pearman's process that he went through to what are these three levels, which is what we're talking about in the beginning, like in the grip and culturally adapted and whole with joy. And it's like, 16 or 32 types, however we want to say, times these 4 or 8 like subtypes, times 3 developmental levels.
Hmm.
And, my purpose isn't to classify people with that like on a giant color wheel.